So while they are heading out the back, today we are starting a new series. And Brian, I forgot. Oh, there we go. So there's a new series image, and it was one of those ones that I pulled in. It looks very similar to this one because, as we've pointed out every Sunday, there's a kind of a continuity all kind of spring and semester. So between now and May, we're looking at the large overarching theme of Jesus is Lord, which you just saw or is up there right now. And there's a new series called Practicing the Kingdom. And this is where we are looking at the lordship of Jesus in the early church and today. And it's okay if you can't find the graphic up there. It looks very similar, and it'll be in the email this coming week as the cover graphic for, there we go, Practicing the Kingdom, the lordship of Jesus in the early church. And so we see that lamb is in Christian history, that lamb represents Jesus, the Lamb of God. And in this series, we see that the lamb has a shovel in his hand, and that's kind of representing the idea of practice, of action here, as we look at what does it mean to live out this lordship. And so what we're going to be doing in this series is diving into what did the early church, how did they do life together and kind of work out for the first time what it means to live out this life under the lordship of Jesus. And so we're going to be looking at these rhythms, practices that we see in the scriptures of the early church's kind of communal life together. And our hope is that it will spark our imagination for what does it look like to live that out today. And so we're going to be looking at some of situations in the New Testament, either in the book of Acts or in some of Paul's letters or other writings that we have where we can see some of the things that they might have been wrestling through in setting up their lives together, so that in every way they can live in submission to King Jesus. And I want to put up one statement on the screen. It says, our hope is that our church will learn to offer ourselves fully to God and to others, just as Jesus did. In light of what we see in the New Testament, we're asking this question: how might we set up our communal life at NLCF in a way that shapes us to live together as citizens of the kingdom under the reign of King Jesus? And that's what this series is all about. Now, before we jump in this morning, I wanted to show a couple pictures. So I am wearing this Bengal sweatshirt, and you can see I've had this for a long time. So that's me when I was younger. And I can't remember exactly how old this sweatshirt is, but it's old enough that the Bengals, I believe, I had it when they were in the Super Bowl the last time. Now, I did grow up a Bengals and a Bills fan. I picked those teams because they had my favorite players on them, and watched the Bengals lose the Super Bowl, watched the Bills lose 4 Super Bowls. And then I met David in college, and he's from Chicago, and so I jumped on to becoming a Bears fan. There's something about the teams that start with the letter B, apparently. That's who I root for. So the last 20 years, became a diehard Bears fan, and it's kind of nice because the Bears are in the NFC, the Bengals and Bills in the AFC. They don't play each other a whole lot. They're not really rivals or anything. So during that time, the Bengals and the Bills were not very good for a long time. But in recent years, they're starting to get better, and the Bears have not been so good. So this year in the playoffs, it was fun to root for the Bills, to root for the Bengals, and hope one of them might make the Super Bowl and see if they could win it. So I am pulling for the Bengals today, but we'll see what happens. But I wanted to show those pictures because I'm going to come back to that setting that you see there on the left. That's at my grandmother's house, and I'm gonna mention that in a little bit. So I wanted to put those pictures up here this morning. Today we are talking about, as we open this series, practicing God's presence. practicing God's presence. That's the first practice that we are looking at. And the reason we're starting with this is because this really goes underneath. It's kind of a foundation for all of the other practices we're going to talk about over the next few weeks. Now, practicing God's presence is a deeply biblical idea, even if we never see that phrase used in the scriptures of practicing God's presence. We know that we see this in there. What we mean when we say practicing God's presence is kind of discerning or developing habits for discerning and awareness of God's presence in our lives each and every day. So in the scriptures, we see language like this, terms like abiding in Jesus, or remaining in Christ, or walking with God, or keeping in step with the Spirit. These are all phrases that describe this action of practicing the presence of God in our daily lives. Now, for me, when thinking about that phrase, practicing the presence of God, one name that comes to my mind is Brother Lawrence. And that's partly because there's a book of writings by Brother Lawrence, which was published under the title, Practicing, or the Practice of the Presence of God. And I have a picture of that right there. You can see Brother Lawrence was, he was around a long, long time ago. Now, there's one saying, one quote that I want to start with from him, where he once said, "It is enough for me to pick up but a straw from the ground for the love of God." So this quote, "It is enough for me to pick up a straw from the ground for the love of God," this makes me think of a passage of Scripture that we find in Paul's letter to the Colossians in chapter 3. And I think this Scripture helps us center in on this idea of what we mean when we talk about practicing the presence of God. This Scripture may be familiar to you. You may have heard these words before. Paul writes, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward." So whatever you do, Paul says, and we've heard this before, haven't you? Whatever we do, do it as you are doing it for the Lord, not for humans. This is what Brother Lawrence figured out. What he figured out was how did he do this in his daily life? And that leads to him saying, "It is enough for me to pick up a straw from the ground for the love of God." You see, who was Brother Lawrence? Well, he wasn't always known as Brother Lawrence. In fact, he was born as Nicholas Herman in 1611. He was the son of peasant parents in Lorraine, France. And he was part of a very poor family. And so his poverty forced him as a young man to join the army, because there he was guaranteed meals and he got a small stipend. And it was during this period that he had an experience that he says set him on his spiritual journey. But it wasn't a supernatural vision. Rather, it was him in a commonplace setting where he had what he would call supernatural clarity. Deep in the winter one year, Herman was looking at a barren tree stripped of all of its leaves and fruit, and he was waiting silently and patiently for the sure hope of the summer abundance. And as he gazed at that tree, he says that for the first time, he grasped the extravagance of God's grace and the unfailing sovereignty of God's divine providence. Because he realized, like the tree, he himself, he felt seemingly dead, but that God had life waiting for him, and that the turn of seasons would bring about this fullness. And at that moment he said, "The leafless tree first flashed in upon my soul the fact of God, and a love for God that never ceased to burn." Now, sometime after this, an injury forced his retirement from the army, and after trying out another job that didn't quite work out, he decided to enter the Discalced Carmelite Monastery in Paris, where he adopted the name Brother Lawrence. And becoming a monk in the monastery, he was assigned to the kitchen, where he would spend the next 40 years. Amidst the tedious chores of cooking and cleaning, at the constant bid of his superiors, and it's in this place, in the kitchen of a monastery in Paris, where Brother Lawrence learned and developed what it meant to practice the presence of God. Now, most of what we know about him actually comes from another man, Abbé de Beaufort, who he was working for the cardinal at the time that Lawrence was serving as a monk, and people started talking in the monastery network chain, right? Word on the street was that this guy working in the kitchen over here had some wisdom that people were encouraged by and challenged by and inspired by. And this was strange because oftentimes those who were working in the kitchen were not seen as the ones who had this great spiritual knowledge or that they had things to contribute. In the monastery, they were kind of just there to do their work and to serve God. And so this cardinal's aide, de Beaufort, he was directed to interview by the cardinal this lowly kitchen aide who had this wisdom that he had heard about. And so Brother Lawrence agreed to 4 kind of interviews with this man, which have come to be called conversations. And it's these conversations that were published later as that book, The Practice of the Presence of God. These recorded conversations. And then after Brother Lawrence passed away in 1691 at the age of 80, some of his fellow monks found in his personal effects some pages of maxims, which was the only organized written material that Brother Lawrence had ever, that they could find that he had written down. It was 16 letters. And so those letters, in addition to the conversations, are what we have left of Brother Lawrence. I want to share a quote from one of the maxims. He writes, "Men invent means and methods of coming at God's love. They learn rules and set up devices to remind them of that love, and it seems like a world of trouble to bring oneself into the consciousness of God's presence. Yet it might be so simple. Is it not quicker and easier just to do our common business wholly for the love of Him?" I love that last phrase. Is it not quicker and easier just to do our common business wholly for the love of Him? You see, common business, no matter how mundane or routine, was the medium of God's love to Brother Lawrence. The issue was not the sacredness of what he was doing or the worldly status of the task at hand, but it was the motivation behind it. He said, "Nor is it needful that we should have great things to do. We can do little things for God. I can turn the cake that is in the frying pan for the love of Him. And that done, if there is nothing else to call me to, then I can prostrate myself and worship before Him, who has given me grace to work. But afterwards, I rise happier than a king, and it is enough for me to pick up but a straw from the ground for the love of God." And so he was explaining this rhythm of where he can go about his work and he can do it, these mundane tasks like cooking or cleaning, and he can see in it God's grace and love. And there are also times where when he had the time, he could choose to get down on his face and his knees in worship. There's this both and here, but it's not the either or, it's the both and. because he got to a place where he realized in his heart and in his life that the love of God made every detail of his life of surpassing value. He said, I began to live as if there was no one except for God and me in the world. And so, kind of together with God, Brother Lawrence did his roles each and every day. He cooked meals, he ran errands, he scrubbed pots. And really, he endured the scorn of the world because he was a lowly kitchen aide in a monastery where nobody really knew about him or who he was, other than those around him that he was serving. But that was okay to him. He spent these years disciplining his heart and his mind to yield to God's presence. He says, as often as I could, I placed myself as a worshiper before him, fixing my mind upon his holy presence, recalling it when I found it wandering from him. And this proved to be an exercise frequently painful, yet I persisted through all the difficulties. And you and I can relate to that, can't we? That thought of wanting to think about God often, but even when we intentionally sit down to try to maybe think about God, we find our minds wandering, and we have to bring them back. But he came to the point of always keeping his mind in God's holy presence. And he said he would recall it as often as he tried to find it wandering from him. And we can relate to Brother Lawrence. But we might think, can I live that way? Can I do that? It's easy to put him on a pedestal because he's a monk, right? His whole life was centered around God. And on some level, that's true. He was working in a monastery. But if we think about it and we think about his jobs as a dishwasher and as a cook, working in the kitchen, that we can relate to. Because many of us have jobs that have mundane tasks to them that may not seem all that important in the grand scheme of life. We also have roles that we play at home. We have dishes to wash, right? We have chores to do. We have trash to pick up around the house. We get this. And so if we can begin to see that really there was nothing special about his circumstances, but instead it was what made him special was him realizing and being able to achieve this practice of allowing God into each and every moment. Author Ken Boa puts it like this. He says, the key truth that Brother Lawrence and others latched onto is that all of life is lived in the presence of God. There's no part of it, nothing too mundane or ordinary, that isn't permeated by him. And friends, that is true for us as well, because these words that Paul writes in Colossians chapter 3, he starts off this section addressing it to slaves. But most of the time when we've heard that verse, 23, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, people weren't speaking that to us as slaves, because we see and we know Paul was using this and writing this to a group of people, but that this was something Paul was encouraging all of us to follow. Whatever we do, because we know this because we see Paul lived this out. Everything he did, he lived this virtue out. Paul didn't get paid in his role in ministry, but instead he chose to be a tent maker. And we see in the book of Acts, he spends time alongside Priscilla and Aquila making tents. And we see in some of the letters, he talks about how he worked in the marketplace making these tents in order that he could support himself and the ministry he was doing as he traveled around. And we have to believe that in those moments, everything Paul did, he did it as he was working for the Lord. He was making those tents for him. So that's our challenge, is to see in our lives, whatever our roles are, whether it's work through employment, whether it's our role in school and our studies, whether it's volunteer work that we do, whether it's our roles in our relationships as parents or children or sisters or brothers or friends or neighbors. Everything we do, we're challenged to do it as if we're doing it for the Lord, because when we can remember that, we remember God's presence is the one that empowers us. His presence is the one that equips us. His presence is the one that abides with us as we are in that moment. And so it's not just us in the dishes. It's not just us talking to our coworker or our neighbor. It's actually God and us in the dishes, and God and us talking with our coworker or our neighbor. C.S. Lewis called this integration of these two realms living as amphibious beings. And what he meant by that was living in both eternity as well as natural time at the same time. This idea that our hearts are connected to the eternity of God and his presence in our lives, but yet we are still in this world living it. And so in some mysterious way, God has made this to be possible where deep in our hearts, in our minds, he has ordered us that we are able to, it is possible to pray and worship at the same time that we go through our daily routine. We can layer these practices into our ordinary lives, the normal everyday business that happens day in and day out. God's presence can infuse this at any moment and in every detail. Now, I want to be clear, this is not the same thing as multitasking, because this is about intentionality. It's what Brother Lawrence called the motivation that he had when he stood there washing dishes. What motivates us to do what we do? If that motivation, that intentionality can be God's love in us and through us, then we too can pick up a straw and with it know it is the love of God working in and with us. So to live like this, to practice God's presence, means to live in a way where we step beyond just taking some time during the day for God, which is good, but it's beginning to take an awareness of God into our lives all day long. And when we do this, we see and experience a rich and purposeful life, fueled by God's power and joy in us. Rather, a life where we feel drained or strained or sputtering. Earlier, I showed a few pictures of me in that Bengals sweatshirt, and 2 of those 3 pictures were taken at my grandmother's house. We called her Meemaw. This is my mom's mom. And Meemaw was a woman, as I was thinking about somebody I know that I feel like lived this out, I would say Meemaw was somebody that lived this out, practicing the presence of God. Now, I don't know that she ever would have called it that, and she may or may not have known who Brother Lawrence was. But it was evident to those around her that she was someone who, when you were around her, you felt like the Lord was with her, and that she knew God was with her at all times. Upon graduating in 1947 from what is now Longwood, it was then called State Teachers College, she was offered a job in Winchester as a school teacher. This past week, my mom found, going through some papers, the offer letter that she had received in 1947, where she was offered the salary of $1,900 to teach for the next school year. She accepted this job and she became a school teacher. She worked for many years as a school teacher, and during that time she got married, began a family, and became active in her local church. Later in life, after she retired from teaching, she continued to take care of her family continued working in her local church, and she began painting ceramics and selling them out of a studio in the town where she and my grandfather, who we called Pawpaw, lived. And in all of these things, whether it was her as a school teacher, whether it was her painting ceramics, whether it was her later in life volunteering at the local history museum in her town, or serving at her church as a Sunday school teacher or in the choir, God was always at the forefront of her mind. When I was in college, she would send me cards randomly, not connected to any holiday, but just cards that would from time to time say, "I was thinking about you and praying for you today." And this was because she spent time every day in prayer, and sometimes it was focused, intentional time sitting at her table and praying, but many times it was just throughout her day she was praying for people as the Lord brought them to mind. She would also always be often singing songs or hymns as she went about her daily work, whether that was doing a task around the house or sitting there painting ceramics. She had a song on her lips, and that was because God's presence was real to her in those moments. In fact, when I was in high school, she was in a car accident that was pretty serious, where she accidentally ran a red light and hit another vehicle. And when police officers asked her about it, she said she had been singing hymns so loudly and was caught up singing them that she hadn't even noticed the light had turned red. And she was just worshiping God and got caught up in it and ran the red light. And she credited God's angels for protecting her, because it was her van was totaled, but she was okay. But that's how she was. Just God was there and present in and with her. One day, I remember when we were a kid, they lived out by the river, and we had to drive into town where the ceramic studio was, and a couple of us grandkids were in the car, and we were going down the road, and somebody on the side of the road was walking down the road, and she thought, oh, maybe that person needs a ride, and so we slowed down, and she invited the person to catch a ride into town, and it was somebody that she loosely knew. But she had the forethought to, even with, grandkids in the backseat of the car probably driving her nuts, to say, hey, here's a person, how can I reach out and help them? And she did it without even, thinking much about it, and it probably wasn't a big deal to her. And if I'd asked her about it later, she might not have remembered that, but I remembered it. And it stuck with me as just an example of a way that she responded to this deep love of God within her, which came out in these different ways. It caused her to see people, to notice needs, to respond humbly with God's love. She was just one of those people who saw other people the way that God did. She and Pawpaw would often open their home and their table to others who could use a welcoming place to sit and talk, or could use a meal. We often had people at family gatherings who weren't a part of our family, and they were always welcome. And Mima and Pawpaw would say, hey, come on over. We're having lunch today. Join us. And I remember at her funeral, one of my cousins shared about, we always played games with Mima. We played card games together, and it was just some part of our childhood was playing games with Mima. And one of my cousins at her funeral shared how when you were with Mima, especially like playing those games, she never seemed like she was in a hurry to do something else. She was just with you. She was present, fully present, giving us her attention. And as I was thinking about it this week, I realized she was fully present giving us her attention, but I believe that's because God was fully present in her in those moments. And so she didn't feel hurried or restless, because she had learned what it was that in every single thing she did it with all of her heart, like she was working for the Lord. And so if that was teaching one of her grandkids how to play rummy, she was doing that for the Lord, just as much as she was when she was earning a paycheck as a school teacher, or painting ceramics to sell, or teaching Sunday school, or singing in the choir. So for us, where are the places that, if we are honest, that we find ourselves being hurried? And how can we ask God to help us to slow down and to practice living in the moment? Because when we take time to recognize the immediate circumstances around us, it gives God space to speak to us, to guide us, to listen to him. And this can happen in informal ways. We can choose to take an intentional time to sit down and ask God to speak to us. But it doesn't always have to be like that. In fact, a lot of times it can be us in our daily lives, but being aware of the moment and being present and slowing down allows us to have space where, without even asking God to speak to us, he will. And we will know his voice, and we will hear it, and we will be prompted to do something or to see something that we might have missed if we had just been hurrying along. And so slowing down, being unhurried in all that we do. And friends, this is hard. I am not great at this. I struggle at this because there's a lot of things at times I am juggling and balancing. And sometimes I've got the next two things I need to do on my mind as I'm in that one. And as I've been thinking about this week, I've been challenged by this. Where are the places where I need to slow down in that moment so that I can be aware of what God might want to say or do? So that I can recognize his presence that is deep within me and learn to live in that space where he is the one who is guiding. James 4:8 encourages us that when we draw near to God, he will draw near to us. And that is where we begin when we think about what does it look like to actually practice this in our lives. Just like any relationship that we are in, where we want to know the other person deeply, we draw closer to them and get to know them and spend time with them. And our hope is that they will draw closer to us. And God promises us that we will. There's a lot of great resources that have been published about practical ways to step into God's presence. Everything from Brother Lawrence's work and life to things written just in the last year or two. One that I want to mention today is by the author that I quoted a few moments ago, Kenneth Boa. He published a book in 2017 called Life in the Presence of God, Practices for Living in Light of Eternity. And along with that, he and another lady, Jenny Abel, they put out a workbook. And in the workbook are some practical tools that you can try. And they talk about, this is not a prescription. This is not a step-by-step, you do this and it's a formula and it's going to work out. It's here are some prompts, here are some ideas, here are some tools that you could use. See what helps you get to a place that you can live slowly and unhurried, that you can call yourself to remembering God in your mind or in your heart. There are all kinds of tools that they share, and I just want to give you two of those today as we close. And I actually have these for you on a little handout, and so we're gonna put them on the screen, and I'll show you. And then if we can get those and pass them around the room here, you'll have this to take home with you. One of them is called a lifestyle tool, and the other one is a prayer tool. So what's a lifestyle tool? Well, it's based on this idea that every day has a mini life of its own, right? Just like life has a birth, then it's followed by growth and then decline and death. All of our days kind of follow this same rhythm where we get ready for the day, we wake up, we get ready for the day, we go about our day, we get ready for bed, we go to sleep. There's this time where we're sleeping, and then we wake up the next day and do it again. It's this cycle. And if we can learn to view life as a series of individual cycles, it can help us to focus in on the present instead of worrying about the future or dwelling in the past. And when we can focus on each day like a cycle, we can actually begin to follow that command of Jesus a little easier when he calls us to take up our cross daily. Because we begin to see life in smaller sections. And so tools like this one called a lifestyle tool, which on your sheet, the one that I'm showing you is called 4 Areas of Gratitude. Lifestyle tools help us to kind of provide these bookends on our days, which help us to be aware of God's presence in our lives. And so this tool is called 4 Areas of Gratitude, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's getting our eyes off of ourselves and onto God in a way where God can kind of turn our lives into this tool of redemption and remembrance, where we cultivate a sense of gratitude for the goodness of life and the tender mercies of God that we might tend to overlook each day if we're just rushing through it hurried. And so in this tool, we're encouraged to think of something we're grateful for in 4 categories. And that's the glory of God's creation, a material blessing, a relational blessing, like someone in our lives, and a spiritual blessing. And so we're just encouraged that maybe at the end of the day, we sit down and we reflect on these things, and that slows us down and it allows us to see where was God present in my life today and what were ways that he blessed me today. And so doing this and maybe journaling this and doing this a few times a week will help us to slow down in our life and be able to identify these places. And we might get to a place where we are thanking God for something that seems simple, that seems mundane, like Brother Lawrence was able to do. The second tool on the back of your sheet is called a flash prayer. Sometimes people call these arrow prayers. And this is basically just a short prayer that we get in the habit of recognizing God's presence all day long. And so what we do is we kind of pick a time that we're going to choose to acknowledge God's presence, and we pick a prayer that's going to go along with that. And by prayer, we mean a simple word or phrase. So there's examples. It could be something simple like, I love you, Lord. It could be something like, I thank you in all things. You can come up with whatever phrase seems to fit. But what you do is you pick a particular time in your day that you are going to remember and just recite this phrase. And that's it. There's no longer part to it, you know? Maybe some of you're in your car a lot. Maybe you're driving between places. So maybe your car becomes the situation. So anytime you get in your car and you turn it on, you have a phrase that you say, a prayer that you say to God, and that's it. But this continual coming back to something like this, again, what it does is it reminds us that in each of those moments, God's presence is with us. And that's the whole purpose, is that we remind ourselves of when God is with us. And so I invite you to try one or both of these out this week and let's see if we can get to a place where we can slow ourselves down and we can begin to experience this presence of God that is already there. We've talked about this, and that's the beauty of this, is that we know that Jesus is with us. He promises that he is with us. Hebrews tells us that he will never leave us nor forsake us. In the end of Matthew's gospel, the last thing that he says is, I will be with you till the very end of the age. He promises us his presence is with us, but the key is not that we're bringing it in, it's that we become aware that it's with us. And that awareness of God's presence is what then changes and transforms us, our minds and our hearts, to allow us to, whatever we do it with all of our hearts as to the Lord. Whatever we do and see and say, it becomes this place that's out of God and what he is doing in our hearts because we know he is with us. So it's not about us trying harder to get this right. It's about recognizing what is already God at work in us and allowing that to flow through us. We're going to continue this series and we're going to continue looking at some other practices, but this one is kind of the one that's going to go underneath all of them. Because, for example, as we next week talk about hospitality, we can't talk about hospitality without first recognizing that that comes from this place of God's presence in our lives. So let's be encouraged to know that he is here and he is near and his kingdom is all around us and we are invited into it. And we're invited to allow him to move us to this place where his presence becomes the thing that whether we use those words or not, it is what sustains us. It is what empowers us each and every day. Would you pray with me? God, we thank you that you are good, and we thank you that your presence is all we need, really. You are this God of abundance who is the great provider. You have plans for us. I think about, Brother Lawrence looking at that tree and coming to this realization that just as you provide, just as the trees go through this cycle where they can seem dead and barren, the spring is coming and the flowers will bloom and the leaves will come. And that allowed him to see, God, you are this God that is in everything. And so he believed that you had this purposeful life for him, whether he could see it in the moment or not. And that purposeful life ended up being washing dishes in a monastery. And you have purposeful lives for us as well. And whatever it looks like, we can know and trust that you want to make our lives bloom, that you want us to flourish as a part of your kingdom because you love us. Not because you need us to flourish for your kingdom to work, but because you love us so much that you want us to flourish for our good and for your glory. That's what Romans tells us. So help us to just hold on to that. Help us to rely on you each and every moment when we feel like we can't do it. Help us to turn to you in those moments. And when we feel like we can do it, help us to turn to you in those moments. Would we begin to just rest in you and your presence? And would you help us? Would you help us to experience it more fully each and every day? I pray this in your mighty name, Jesus. Amen.